The morning haze over Assam, India hung thick on December 13, 1943. Second Lieutenant Philip Adair banked his Curtiss P-40N Warhawk into a climbing turn, the Allison engine's familiar rumble vibrating through the control stick. At 23 years old, with 43 combat missions already behind him, Adair knew these skies. He'd flown patrol over the Hump airlift route dozens of times, watching for Japanese raiders who prowled the supply lines like sharks in dark water. But this morning would be different. This morning, he would face odds that no fighter pilot manual had ever contemplated. At 9:27 a.m., movement caught his eye through the milky haze. 3 miles east, a dark mass materialized against the pale sky. At first, he thought it was a small formation, maybe a dozen aircraft. Then, as the shapes resolved through the morning light, his stomach tightened. This wasn't a small formation. Stretched across the eastern horizon were 64 Japanese aircraft, a massive armada heading directly toward his base at Dinjan Airfield. 24 Mitsubishi Ki-21 Sally bombers flew in tight V formations, their twin radial engines glinting in the sun. Above and below them, layers of Nakajima Ki-43 Oscar fighters wove protective patterns, approximately 40 of them creating a moving cage of firepower around the bomber stream. Below him, Dinjan Airfield housed 14 C-47 transport aircraft, loaded with critical supplies bound for China. A field hospital treating 63 wounded soldiers, fuel stock sufficient to support Hump operations for 11 days. If those bombers reached the field unopposed, they would destroy the lifeline keeping Chinese forces in the fight against Japan. The damage would cripple Allied supply operations over the Himalayas for weeks. Adair checked his fuel gauge. Full internal tanks, 180 gallons, approximately 90 minutes of flight time at combat power. He glanced down at his aircraft. Lulu Bell, number 44, painted on her nose, beneath the distinctive Death's Head skull that marked all aircraft of the 80th Fighter Group. 650 caliber Browning machine guns, enough ammunition for approximately 12 seconds of sustained fire if he held the trigger down. His mind ran the calculation automatically. A survival instinct drilled into him through dozens of missions. 64 enemy aircraft, 40 fighters designed to kill planes exactly like his, 24 bombers carrying enough explosives to level everything he was sworn to protect. The nearest friendly fighters were 38 minutes away at Jorhat. Standard doctrine was clear when outnumbered more than 5 to 1. Shadow the formation, radio for help, wait for reinforcements. But in 38 minutes, those bombers would be over Dinjan. The bombs would already be falling. The hospital, the transports, the fuel stocks, all of it would be burning. Philip Adair pushed the throttle forward. The China-Burma-India theater was the forgotten war within the greater war. While headlines screamed about D-Day and island hopping in the Pacific, a different struggle unfolded in the monsoon-soaked jungles and cloud-shrouded mountains of Asia. Of the millions of Americans under arms during World War II, only about 250,000 served in the CBI theater. Just 2%. But their mission was critical to keeping China in the fight and preventing Japan from consolidating its hold on Asia. At the heart of this mission was an operation unprecedented in its ambition and deadly in its execution. The Hump Airlift. When Japanese forces severed the Burma Road in 1942, cutting off the last land route into China, the Allies faced a choice. They could abandon Chiang Kai-shek's forces to slow strangulation, or they could devise something that had never been attempted before. They chose the impossible. The Hump was the nickname Allied pilots gave to their route over the eastern Himalayas. From airfields in India's Assam Valley, transport aircraft loaded with fuel, ammunition, weapons, medical supplies, and everything else needed to sustain an army would climb into the sky and disappear into clouds that shrouded mountains reaching above 20,000 feet. The route stretched 500 miles from Dinjan to Kunming, crossing some of the most hostile terrain on Earth. The Brahmaputra Valley floor at Chabwa sat just 90 feet above sea level. From there, pilots had to clear the Patkai Range, then cross the upper Chindwan River Valley, then navigate the Sansung Range with its peaks jutting 15,000 feet into weather that could kill as efficiently as any Japanese fighter. Violent turbulence, 100-mile-per-hour winds, icing conditions that could coat an aircraft in ice until the added weight dragged it into the mountains. Weather so fierce that pilots joked they'd be lucky to see the ground between India and China. The casualty rate for hump crews approximated combat duty over Germany. More than 1,000 men and 600 aircraft were lost over that 530-mile stretch. The wreckage scattered across the valleys earned it the nickname the Aluminum Trail. But the supplies had to get through. By the time Philip Adair climbed into his cockpit, that December morning, the hump operation had grown from a handful of C-47s, delivering meager tons to a full-fledged aerial lifeline, moving thousands of tons monthly. Every gallon of fuel, every weapon, every round of ammunition used by American forces in China came over the hump. The airlift was the only thing keeping Chiang Kai-shek's armies equipped to tie down over 1 million Japanese troops who would otherwise be deployed against Allied forces elsewhere in the Pacific. And the Japanese knew it. Throughout late 1943, they had launched increasingly aggressive raids against Allied airfields in northeast India. In the previous 8 weeks alone, Japanese attacks had destroyed 47 transport aircraft on the ground and killed 112 personnel. Intelligence reports indicated similar raids in Burma had achieved 90% hit rates on undefended airfields. The pattern was clear and brutal. If the Japanese could destroy enough transports on the ground, they could strangle the hump without ever touching the mountains. And on December 13, 1943, they were about to try again. The 80th Fighter Group's journey to the jungles of Assam had begun half a world away, in the winter slush and crowds of New York. The group was constituted on January 13, 1942, activated in February at Mitchell Field on Long Island. 3 fighter squadrons formed its backbone, the 88th, 89th, and 90th Pursuit Squadrons, though the designation would change from pursuit to fighter by May. Fresh-faced pilots arrived in July 1942 and began training on the Republic P-47 Thunderbolt, the massive single-engine fighter that had earned the affectionate nickname Jug for its bulky fuselage. For months, they flew training missions over the northeastern United States, part of the Defense Force protecting against the Nazi submarine threat. Pilots and ground crews lived in hotels in New York City, and stories of their off-duty adventures in Manhattan became legendary within the group. But they all knew the parties would end. The Pacific was burning, and they would be sent east. In May 1943, the 80th shipped out from New York Harbor, bound for Karachi, India. The journey was long and tedious. Days at sea turned into weeks. When they finally reached India, they faced an overland trek across the subcontinent. From Karachi, they traveled by rail through landscapes that seemed from another world. Then came the transition from P-47s to Curtiss P-40 Warhawks. The Thunderbolt was powerful but thirsty, demanding fuel capacity that couldn't be supported in the austere conditions of forward airfields. The P-40, older and considered obsolescent by many, was rugged, reliable, and could operate from rough strips carved out of tea plantations. By August 1943, ground personnel and aircraft had ferried across India and entered the combat zone in Assam. The 80th joined experienced personnel from the 51st Fighter Group, already fighting in theater. In September 1943, the Burma Banshees, as they would come to call themselves, commenced combat missions. Their threefold mission was clear: provide close air support for General Stilwell's forces pushing into Burma and building the Ledo Road, fighter protection for the Air Transport Command's hump flights into China, and air defense for the Assam Valley, which had become a significant supply hub. The group's distinctive marking set them apart. A white death's head skull dominated the nose of every P-40, grinning at enemy pilots with empty eye sockets. The skull wasn't just for show, it sent a message. Some aircraft were fitted with belly-mounted air sirens that when activated made what pilots called the Banshee wail, a shrieking sound that preceded strafing runs and bombing attacks. The psychological impact on Japanese troops was immediate and lasting. When they heard that wail echoing across the jungle, they knew death was diving toward them. The 80th quickly proved their worth. Flying modified P-40s they called B-40s, fitted with 1,000-pound bombs, they attacked Japanese-held bridges with devastating accuracy. Sometimes they demolished a bridge with a single bomb. By the end of the war, the group would destroy more than 200 bridges and kill scores of bridge repair crews. In air-to-air combat, they claimed 80 enemy planes destroyed in the air or on the ground. But in December 1943, they were still relatively new to combat operations. The 89th Fighter Squadron, Philip Adair's unit, had been flying combat missions for just over 2 months. Philip Reed Adair was born in Tuttle, Oklahoma, on April 15, 1920. As a youngster, he watched Army Air Corps pilots from nearby Wichita Falls buzz his family's farm, their biplanes roaring low enough to spook the horses. Those early sightings planted a seed. Aviation wasn't just a profession for young Adair. It was a calling that burned in his chest like a furnace. But dreams required money, and the Adair family didn't have much to spare. After graduating high school in 1937, college wasn't an option. Instead, Philip took a job as a candy salesman, working long hours and saving every penny he could. His goal was singular: flying lessons. For months, he lived frugally, denying himself everything except the bare necessities, funneling his earnings toward that impossible dream of slipping the bounds of Earth. By December 1941, when Pearl Harbor brought America into the war, Adair had his pilot's license. The Army Air Corps accepted him as a cadet immediately. The transformation from candy salesman to military aviator happened with stunning speed. He moved through advanced training, initially on P-47 Thunderbolts at Mitchell Field, New York. Then came assignment to the 89th Fighter Squadron of the 80th Fighter Group and the long journey to India. By December 13, 1943, 2nd Lieutenant Adair had flown 43 combat missions. He was the flight leader for D-Flight, despite still being a second lieutenant, promoted to that position because his experience exceeded that of the other pilots in the squadron. At 23, he was a veteran in a theater where survival itself was an accomplishment. His aircraft was a Curtiss P-40N Warhawk, nicknamed Lulu Bell and marked with the number 44. The P-40 wasn't the fastest fighter in the sky, nor was it the most heavily armed. By late 1943, it was considered obsolete by many standards, but in the hands of a skilled pilot who understood its strengths and limitations, the P-40 was a formidable weapon. The Warhawk's Allison V17-1081 engine generated 1,240 horsepower at 3,000 RPM, giving the aircraft a maximum speed of 378 miles per hour below 12,000 feet. That speed advantage over slower Japanese fighters would prove crucial. The P-40N featured a stretched rear fuselage to counter engine torque and a cut-down rear deck behind the cockpit that improved rearward visibility. Weight reduction efforts had stripped away everything non-essential. Early N production blocks dropped one .50 caliber gun from each wing, bringing the total to 4, though later blocks reintroduced the 6th gun after complaints from units in the field. The P-40's strength wasn't turning ability. The lightweight Japanese Oscar could out-turn it every time, but the Warhawk could dive faster than anything the Japanese had. It was rugged, with armor protection for the pilot and self-sealing fuel tanks that could take punishment and keep flying. Adair had learned to leverage these advantages. Never turn with an Oscar. Use speed. Hit hard, extend away, reset, attack again. The tactics were simple in concept, but demanded iron discipline in execution. A pilot who forgot and tried to dogfight an Oscar would find himself in a tightening circle, losing energy, becoming an easy target. Adair also knew his ammunition capacity by heart. 6.50 caliber Brownings carried roughly 500 rounds per gun. With all 6 guns firing, that gave him approximately 40 seconds of trigger time total. But sustained bursts drained ammunition fast. Most effective shooting came in 2 to 3 second bursts, carefully aimed, conserving rounds for multiple attacks. This mission would demand every ounce of that ammunition discipline. The morning of December 13th had begun routinely. D-Flight drew patrol duty over the hump route, standard procedure for protecting the vital transport corridor. Adair led a flight of 4 P-40s into the crisp morning air, his element leader Lieutenant May flying on his wing. The weather was clear at altitude, though haze reduced visibility closer to the ground. They flew their patrol route, scanning for Japanese intruders, finding nothing. By mid-morning, fuel levels dictated a return to base. All 4 P-40s landed at their forward base, and ground crews swarmed the aircraft, refueling them quickly while pilots stretched legs cramped from sitting in narrow cockpits. Adair had just climbed out of Lulu Belle when the alarm sounded. The distinctive wail cut through the morning air, and every pilot froze for a heartbeat. Incoming enemy aircraft. Ground controllers were tracking a large formation approaching from the east. The other 3 P-40s weren't fully fueled yet. Their pilots scrambled, but the ground crews waved them back. Not enough fuel to make contact. The tanks needed more time. Adair's Lulu Belle was topped off. Full tanks. He made a split-second decision that would define the rest of his life. He climbed back into the cockpit, strapped in, and fired up the Allison. The engine caught immediately, the big propeller spinning up to speed. He didn't wait for clearance, didn't wait for backup. Lulu Belle's wheels lifted off the rough strip, and Adair climbed hard into the eastern sky, alone. As he gained altitude, ground control provided updates. Large formation, very large, still tracking east, heading directly for Dinjan. Adair pushed the throttle to the stop, the manifold pressure climbing to 54 inches. The P-40 accelerated, clawing for altitude. He positioned himself 4,000 feet above the bomber formation's reported altitude, coming at them from the south with the sun behind him. Classic tactics. Height equals energy equals life. Then he saw them, and his breath caught in his throat. The formation stretched across the sky like a deadly geometric pattern. 6 aircraft arranged in 2 Vs of 3. That was just the lead element. Behind them, more Vs, more bombers. Adair's combat-trained mind counted automatically. 24 Mitsubishi Ki-21 Sally bombers, their twin radial engines pulling them through the morning air at approximately 240 miles per hour. Their greenhouse cockpits glinted in the sunlight. Each bomber carried a crew of 5 to 7 men and a bomb load of over 2,000 pounds, enough to obliterate everything at Dinjan. But it was the escort that made Adair's tactical situation impossible. 40 Nakajima Ki-43 Oscar fighters wove above and below the bomber stream in complex patterns. The Oscar was one of the most maneuverable fighters in the Pacific. Powered by the Nakajima Ha-115 engine, producing 1,150 horsepower, it could reach 329 miles per hour at 13,000 feet and execute turning circles tighter than any American fighter. Its secret was the unique butterfly combat flaps, aerodynamic surfaces that deployed from the wings to allow the Oscar to bleed speed rapidly in turns without stalling. Japanese pilots exploited this advantage ruthlessly. In the previous 6 months, Oscars had shot down 63 Allied fighters over Burma and northeast India. The Oscar's weaknesses were known to every American pilot in theater. Light construction, no armor for the pilot, no self-sealing fuel tanks. The early models carried only 2 7.7mm machine guns, though some later variants upgraded to 12.7mm weapons. One good burst of .50 caliber fire could tear an Oscar apart, but you had to hit it first, and hitting a violently maneuvering target while 40 other fighters tried to kill you demanded skill and luck in equal measure. Adair had neither numbers nor surprise on his side once he opened fire. He had one advantage and one advantage only. The bombers hadn't spotted him yet. Their attention was focused forward on the target. The Oscar pilots, confident in their numerical superiority, weren't expecting a lone American fighter to attack 20 miles out from the target. They expected defensive fighters to scramble from Dinjan itself, giving the bombers time to drop their ordnance before any interception occurred. The mathematics of the situation were brutal. 64 Japanese aircraft, 1 P-40, 64 to 1 odds. Against doctrine, against reason, against every principle of fighter tactics ever taught. But Philip Adair wasn't thinking about doctrine. He was thinking about the hospital at Dinjan, the wounded men who couldn't evacuate, the transport crews who would be sitting ducks on the ground, the irreplaceable fuel stocks. The entire hump operation balanced on a knife's edge, and if those bombers reached Dinjan unopposed, the edge would tip toward disaster. He rolled inverted, pulled the nose down, and dove at the bombers from their 7 o'clock high position. The airspeed built rapidly, 320 miles per hour, 340, 360. The P-40 screamed down out of the sun, and Adair's world narrowed to the illuminated pipper of his gun sight and the growing silhouettes of the Sally bombers ahead. At 800 yards, Adair opened fire. All 650 caliber Brownings hammered in unison, the aircraft shuddering with recoil. Tracers arced toward the lead bomber, and Adair walked his rounds up the Sally's left wing. Fabric tore, metal sparked. Then the port engine erupted in a fireball of orange flame, black smoke pouring from the cowling. The bomber shuddered, rolled right, and its tight V formation dissolved. Bombers scattered left and right, their neat geometric pattern breaking into chaos. Adair pulled up hard, 7 Gs crushing him into his seat. The world grayed at the edges as blood drained from his brain toward his feet. He rolled right, fighting the G-forces, his vision tunneling. Then the pressure eased, and color flooded back. He'd gained about 1,000 feet in the pullout. His eyes scanned the sky. 40 Oscar fighters were diving toward him from multiple directions. Standard P-40 tactics against Oscars flashed through his mind. Never turn with them. Use speed. Hit and run. Extend away. Reset. But extending away meant abandoning the bombers, and if he fled, they would reform and complete their attack run. Adair couldn't extend. He had to keep pressure on the formation, keep them scattered, keep them nervous, even if it meant fighting 40 Oscars alone, while violating every tactical principle he'd been taught. The first 4 Oscars came at him in a loose finger 4 formation from his 10 o'clock high. Adair rolled left, pulled the nose up, and fired a 2-second burst at the lead fighter. His 50 caliber rounds missed high. The Oscar broke right, its wingman following. Adair reversed, diving away to maintain his critical speed advantage. 2 more Oscars dove from above. He saw them at 400 yards, pulled into a climbing left turn, fired again. No hits. His ammunition counter showed 800 rounds remaining across all 6 guns. Approximately 6 more attacks at his current rate of fire before he was Winchester. Out of ammunition, defenseless. Behind the fighter screen, the Sally bombers were attempting to reform. 3 groups of 6 aircraft each were closing back into formation. If they achieved their bombing Vs again, they would press the attack. Adair estimated he had perhaps 90 seconds before they reached their release point over Dinjan. He rolled out, shoved the throttle to the stop, and dove toward the bombers again. 8 Oscars followed him down, but the P-40 accelerated to 405 miles per hour in the dive. The lightweight Oscars couldn't match that speed. Adair opened the gap, pulled out at bomber altitude, and lined up on the right-hand Sally formation. Range 300 yards. He fired. Tracers converged on the lead bomber's right engine. The Mitsubishi HA-101 radial engine exploded in a fireball. The bomber rolled right, streaming fire and debris. Its wingman broke formation to avoid collision. Adair kicked rudder, skidded left, fired at another Sally. His rounds punched through the bomber's thin fuselage skin, walking up from tail to cockpit. The Ki-21 had no armor protection for the crew, no self-sealing fuel tanks. It was designed in 1936, obsolete by 1943 standards, vulnerable to the concentrated firepower of 650 caliber guns, but it could still carry over 2,000 pounds of bombs. That made it deadly even in death. The Oscar fighters closed again, 12 of them this time. Adair's fuel gauge showed 162 gallons remaining. His ammunition counter read 650 rounds. The bombers were 19 miles from Dinjan. He had perhaps 4 minutes before they reached drop range, and then his engine temperature started climbing into the red. The Allison V1710-81 was a liquid-cooled engine. Coolant circulated through passages in the cylinder heads and block, absorbing heat from combustion, then flowed through a radiator mounted beneath the fuselage. At combat power settings above 50 inches of manifold pressure, the engine generated extreme temperatures. The coolant system could handle sustained operation at those settings for approximately 20 minutes. Adair had been running at full power for 11 minutes. His coolant temperature gauge showed 230 degrees Fahrenheit. Normal operating temperature was 210. At 250, the engine would begin to fail. Metal components would expand, tolerances would close, pistons would seize, connecting rods would snap. The engine would destroy itself. He had three options: reduce power to let the engine cool, which meant abandoning the attack and returning to base; continue fighting and risk engine failure over hostile territory, which was currently occupied by Japanese patrols who tortured captured American pilots before killing them; or keep the throttle forward and trust that Lulubelle's tough engine would hold together long enough to finish the mission. The Sally bombers were 17 miles from Dingen, still within bombing range, still a threat to everything he was sworn to protect. Adair kept the throttle forward. Two Oscars came at him head-on. Combined closing speed exceeded 600 miles per hour. Both Japanese fighters opened fire at 500 yards. Adair saw their muzzle flashes. 7.7mm tracers walked toward his nose. He fired back. His heavier .50 caliber rounds carried more energy and reached farther. At 350 yards, his rounds hit the left Oscar's engine cowling. The lightweight fighter shuddered, broke left, trailing white coolant vapor. Its wingman followed. Adair rolled right and dove. His coolant temperature hit 240 degrees. The Sally bombers were 15 miles from target. Two formations of 6 aircraft each had reformed into bombing Vs. The third formation was scattered, 3 bombers struggling to rejoin. He went for the lead formation again. 6 Oscars tried to intercept him. He dove past them at 390 miles per hour, too fast for them to follow effectively. At bomber altitude, he leveled out and opened fire on the lead Sally. His first burst hit the bomber's right wing root. The wing structure failed catastrophically. The outer panel folded upward and tore away. The Sally rolled inverted and entered a spin. No parachutes emerged. The crew rode it down to impact. The formation broke again. Bombers scattered in 3 directions. Their bombing accuracy was destroyed. Even if they dropped now, their bombs would be spread across miles of jungle instead of concentrated on the airfield. Adair pulled up hard. His coolant temperature gauge showed 248 degrees. The engine was running rough. He could feel vibration through the control stick. Detonation was starting in the cylinders, pre-ignition from excessive heat. If he didn't reduce power soon, the engine would seize. 8 Oscars dove on him from above. He saw them late, rolled left. Too slow. 7.7mm rounds punched through his right wing. Fabric tore, metal buckled. 1 round hit his right aileron control rod. The aileron response went mushy. He needed more right stick pressure to maintain level flight. Another burst walked up his fuselage. Rounds sparked off his engine cowling. 1 penetrated the coolant reservoir behind the firewall. Green coolant sprayed across his windscreen. The engine temperature gauge climbed past 260 degrees. Steam erupted from the cowling seams. His oil pressure dropped. The Allison was dying. Adair chopped the throttle. The engine RPM fell from 3,000 to 2,400. Not enough power to maintain altitude. The P-40 started descending at 1,000 feet per minute, then 1,500. The Oscars circled above him, waiting. Then his engine caught fire. Fire in a liquid-cooled aircraft engine follows a predictable sequence. Burning coolant vaporizes and ignites first. Flames spread forward along the engine cowling, drawn by airflow. If the fire reaches the fuel lines running along the engine's left side, the aircraft explodes. Adair had perhaps 30 seconds before that happened. Standard procedure for engine fires was immediate shutdown and bailout, but his altitude was only 8,000 feet and descending rapidly. He was 12 miles from friendly territory over jungle, where Japanese patrols operated. Ground controllers had reported increased enemy activity in the area following recent Allied advances. Adair kept the engine running. The Allison's fuel mixture could be leaned manually. He pulled the mixture control back to idle cutoff for 3 seconds, starving the engine of fuel. The fire intensity decreased. He pushed the mixture forward again. The engine coughed, caught, continued running, but rough. Power output had dropped to approximately 60%, not enough to climb, barely enough to maintain level flight. He was committed now to flying home on a burning, damaged engine or abandoning the aircraft over hostile territory. Behind him, The Sally bombers were 13 miles from Dinjan, still close enough to turn back and attack. But their formations had disintegrated. Individual bombers were heading southeast toward Burma, abandoning the raid. The mission was accomplished. The airfield was safe. Adair turned southwest toward his base at Nagaguli, 43 miles away. Approximately 15 minutes of flight time if the engine kept running. 6 Oscars followed him. At 7,000 feet, his engine oil pressure dropped to 0. The Allison ran on oil pressure to lubricate its connecting rods, crankshaft, and camshaft. Without oil pressure, metal ground against metal. Friction generated heat. Heat caused expansion. Components seized. Adair felt the engine vibration increase. The propeller began windmilling unevenly. Power output fell further. His airspeed dropped to 180 miles per hour. The P-40's stall speed was 120. He was losing the margin between controlled flight and falling. The Oscars closed to 400 yards, but didn't fire. They were watching, waiting for the engine to fail completely, waiting for him to bail out or crash. One Oscar pulled alongside close enough for Adair to see the pilot's face. The Japanese pilot gestured downward. Land the aircraft. Surrender. Become a prisoner. Adair ignored him. At 6,000 feet, smoke began filling his cockpit, not from the engine fire but from electrical wiring behind the instrument panel. The rounds that had hit his fuselage had severed control cables and damaged the electrical system. Smoke burned his eyes and throat. He slid the canopy open. Wind blast cleared some of the smoke, but made breathing difficult. His airspeed fell to 160 miles per hour. The Oscars backed off. They weren't going to waste ammunition. The American pilot was already dead. His aircraft was crippled. The engine was dying. He would crash in the jungle. They circled higher, watching him descend. At 4,000 feet, Adair's right aileron control cable snapped. The aileron flopped to full deflection. The P-40 rolled right, and the nose dropped into a dive. He hauled back on the control stick with both hands. Nothing. The elevator cables were damaged. He had no pitch control. The nose stayed down. His airspeed increased. 200 miles per hour, 220, 250. The jungle rushed up at him. Altitude 3,000 feet, 2,500, 2,000. He was going to crash. Then, a thought crystallized in his mind with the clarity that sometimes comes in moments of mortal crisis. The P-40's damaged aileron was forcing the right wing down. The broken elevator cables left the horizontal stabilizer in a nose-down position. Gravity and aerodynamic forces were pulling the aircraft into an uncontrolled dive, but aerodynamics work in both directions. If he rolled the aircraft inverted, the damaged aileron would force the right wing up instead of down. The elevator stuck in nose-down trim would push the tail down, lifting the nose up. Flying upside down would reverse the control inputs. The damage that was killing him right side up might save him inverted. At 1,800 feet above the jungle, Adair rolled the P-40 completely inverted. -1 G pressed him against his shoulder straps. Blood rushed to his head. His vision turned red around the edges, the beginning of a redout. The fuel system designed for positive G loads struggled to feed fuel to the engine inverted. The Allison coughed, sputtered, nearly quit, then caught again, running rough but producing power. The nose came up. The descent slowed. At 1,200 feet, the P-40 leveled out, flying upside down at 140 miles per hour. Adair held the inverted attitude for 40 seconds. His airspeed increased to 160. He was climbing slowly, 50 feet per minute, but climbing. Then the fuel starvation problem returned. The engine began cutting out. He rolled right side up. The damaged controls immediately pushed the nose down. The P-40 descended again at 600 feet per minute. Adair waited until he'd lost 300 feet, then rolled inverted again. The nose came up. He climbed 200 feet before fuel starvation forced him to roll upright. The pattern repeated, upside down to climb, right side up to let fuel feed properly. Flip, climb, flip, descend, flip, climb. The 6 Oscars circling above watched this impossible display. An American P-40 with a burning engine and damaged controls, flying alternately inverted and upright, refusing to crash, clawing for altitude with the determination of a wounded animal, refusing to die. One Oscar dove to investigate. Adair saw him coming, rolled inverted to gain altitude, then rolled upright directly at the Japanese fighter. The Oscar broke away. The American pilot was either insane or desperate. Either way, the Oscars decided not to engage. They turned east toward Burma. Adair continued his rolling climb toward Nagaguli. His fuel gauge showed 83 gallons. His oil pressure gauge showed 0. The needle pegged there for 9 minutes. The engine should have seized by now. Connecting rods should have welded to the crankshaft. The fact that it still ran defied mechanical logic. The Allison was running on momentum, friction, and whatever microscopic oil film remained on its internal components. His altitude reached 3,000 feet, then 4,000. The base at Nagaguli was 21 miles southwest, approximately 11 minutes away if he maintained current speed. His coolant temperature gauge no longer registered. The needle had melted off at some point. Smoke still poured from the cowling, but the flames had died down, either because the fire had consumed all available fuel or because the lack of coolant had somehow starved it. At 5,000 feet, Adair spotted Nagaguli airfield ahead. The runway, the tower, the revetments, safety. But he faced a new problem. His landing gear was hydraulic. The hydraulic system ran on engine power. His engine was producing minimal power and might quit completely any second. If he lowered the gear and the engine died, he would crash short of the runway with the gear down, probably cartwheeling and burning. If he kept the gear up and tried a belly landing, the impact might rupture his remaining fuel tanks, and the aircraft would burn anyway. He needed the gear down and locked before the engine failed. He reached for the gear lever. His right hand was shaking, not from fear, but from carbon monoxide poisoning. The cockpit smoke had been accumulating for 14 minutes. He pulled the gear lever down. Nothing happened. The P-40's hydraulic system operated at 1,000 pounds per square inch. Hydraulic fluid, pressurized by an engine-driven pump, flowed through steel lines to actuators that extended and retracted the landing gear. With the engine producing minimal power, the hydraulic pump wasn't generating sufficient pressure. The gear remained locked in the up position. The P-40 had a backup system, a manual hand pump mounted on the left side of the cockpit. 28 strokes of the pump handle would manually pressurize the hydraulic system enough to lower the gear. Adair grabbed the pump handle with his left hand, keeping his right hand on the control stick. He pumped. 1, 2, 3, nothing. The gear stayed up. The hand pump required both hands for effective operation, but releasing the stick meant losing aircraft control. His damaged ailerons and elevator would immediately push the nose down. He reached behind his seat and pulled his lap belt loose, wrapped it around the control stick, looped it through the seat frame, pulled it tight. The makeshift rig held the stick in approximate neutral position. Not perfect control, but enough to keep the aircraft flying straight. He grabbed the hand pump with both hands and pumped hard. 5 strokes, 10, 15. At stroke 23, he felt resistance, hydraulic pressure building. At stroke 28, he heard a thunk from beneath the cockpit. The left main gear extended and locked. The right main gear followed 3 seconds later. The P-40 was now draggy. Gear down increased drag significantly. His airspeed fell from 160 miles per hour to 135, still above stall speed, but not by much. The engine was producing perhaps 40% power now, barely enough to maintain altitude with the gear extended. Nagaguli runway was 7 miles ahead, 3 minutes if he maintained speed. His vision tunneled. Gray edges closed in from the periphery. Carbon monoxide poisoning was affecting his brain function. He shook his head, focused on the runway. 6 miles. His engine temperature gauge, the one that still worked, showed 310 degrees, far beyond red line. Metal components inside the engine were expanding from heat. Tolerances were closing. Any second now, a piston would seize, or a valve would stick, or a connecting rod would snap. 5 miles. Tower operators at Nagaguli saw him coming, a P-40 with smoke trailing from the cowling, flying erratically, gear down. They assumed he would make a normal approach, lower the flaps, reduce speed, touch down on the main wheels first. Standard landing procedure. But Adair's flaps were hydraulic too. With minimal engine power, he couldn't pump enough hydraulic pressure for both gear and flaps. The gear was down. The flaps stayed up. Landing without flaps meant higher landing speed, 120 miles per hour instead of 90. That meant longer landing roll. Nagaguli's runway was 4,000 feet long. A flapless landing in a damaged aircraft required at least 3,000 feet, doable if he maintained airspeed, if the engine kept running, if he touched down smoothly. At 2 miles from the runway, his engine quit. The propeller windmilled to a stop. No power, no thrust. The P-40 became a glider, a very poor glider. The Warhawk's glide ratio was approximately 8-to-1. From 2,000 feet altitude, he could glide approximately 3 miles. The runway was 2 miles away, theoretically possible, but his damaged aircraft had extra drag from battle damage, bullet holes in wings, and fuselage disrupted airflow. His actual glide ratio was worse than normal, perhaps 6-to-1. He wasn't going to make the runway. After surviving 64 Japanese aircraft, after flying inverted for 11 minutes, after nursing a dying engine for 15 miles, he would crash 200 yards short of safety because his engine quit at the worst possible moment. Then he remembered something from training. Something his instructor had said about P-40 glide performance. Something about flying inverted. In a normal glide, an aircraft descends nose first, gravity pulling it downward while wings generate lift. But inverted, the aerodynamics reverse. The wings camber designed to generate lift upward when right side up generates downward force when inverted. However, at specific angles of attack, this reversal creates less drag than right side up flight. An inverted glide could theoretically extend range by reducing drag. The principle had been mentioned briefly during training. No instructor expected pilots to actually use it, but Adair had nothing to lose. He rolled inverted at 1,800 feet, 1 mile from the runway. Blood rushed to his head. His vision reddened. He held the inverted attitude, watching the jungle pass beneath him or above him. Perspective became disorienting. The airspeed held steady at 125 miles per hour. The descent rate was 500 feet per minute, better than the 700 feet per minute he'd been experiencing right side up. Tower operators at Nagaguli saw an inverted P-40 approaching with landing gear extended. Gear down while inverted was aerodynamically wrong, structurally stressful. The gear doors designed to handle air loads from below were now subjected to loads from above. But the gear held. On the ground, Technical Sergeant Robert Martinez watched through binoculars. He saw the inverted aircraft, saw the gear extended, saw smoke trailing from the engine. His first thought was that a Japanese pilot had stolen a P-40 and was attempting to strafe the field. Martinez ran toward the nearest 50 caliber machine gun position. 3 other ground crew followed him. They reached the gun emplacement and began traversing the weapon toward the approaching aircraft. Adair was at 400 feet altitude, half a mile from the runway threshold, still inverted. His vision was fading. Gray tunnels closed in. Carbon monoxide and negative G-forces were shutting down his brain. He had perhaps 20 seconds of consciousness remaining. He needed to roll upright, line up with the runway, and land. If he rolled upright too soon, the damaged controls would push the nose down and he'd crash short. If he rolled too late, he'd overshoot the runway. At 200 feet altitude, 300 yards from the threshold, Adair rolled right side up. The damaged aileron immediately pushed the right wing down. He countered with left stick, fighting the aircraft, forcing the wings level. The nose wanted to drop. He pulled back on the stick. The broken elevator cables gave him partial control. Not much, just enough. The P-40 descended toward the runway at a steep angle, nose high, wings wobbling. Martinez's gun crew tracked the aircraft. The P-40 was definitely damaged. Smoke poured from it. It might be friendly. It might be enemy. In 3 seconds, the aircraft would cross the runway threshold. Martinez had to decide, shoot or hold fire. He held fire. Adair crossed the threshold at 90 feet, descending rapidly. Too fast, too steep. The P-40 dropped the last 90 feet in 4 seconds. The main wheels hit the concrete runway hard. 7G impact. The gear struts compressed fully. The tail wheel slammed down. Metal shrieked. The right main gear collapsed. The right wing dropped. The wingtip hit the runway and dug in. The aircraft ground looped right, spinning 180 degrees, throwing up sparks and concrete fragments. It skidded backward for 200 feet and stopped. Smoke billowed from the engine compartment. Fire crews raced toward the aircraft. Adair sat motionless in the cockpit for 12 seconds. His hands were still gripping the control stick. His mind was blank, shock and exhaustion overwhelming his system. Then, survival instincts kicked in. He released his shoulder straps, stood up on wobbling legs, and climbed out onto the wing. His legs buckled. He caught himself on the wing root. Ground crew reached him and helped him down. Martinez arrived with the fire crew. They opened the cowling. The Allison engine was destroyed. Pistons seized. Crankshaft warped. Oil pan ruptured. Coolant everywhere. 3 connecting rods were welded to the crankshaft. The coolant system was destroyed. Every cylinder showed scoring. Adair walked around the aircraft with Martinez. They counted the damage together. 16 bullet holes in the fuselage, 7 in the right wing, 4 in the left. 1 round had severed the right aileron control cable completely. Another had punctured the hydraulic reservoir. A third had cut through 2 electrical bundles behind the instrument panel. Lulu Bell would never fly again. But Philip Adair had saved Dinjan Airfield. Intelligence reports confirmed that all 24 Sally bombers had turned back without dropping their ordnance. The Japanese formation had scattered 15 miles short of target. 40 Oscar fighters had escorted empty bombers back to Burma. 0 bombs hit Allied facilities. 0 casualties on the ground. 14 C-47 transports remained operational. The hump airlift continued without interruption. 3 days later, on December 16, 1943, 10th Air Force Headquarters interviewed Adair about the engagement. He described the attack sequence, the inverted flying technique, the landing approach. Flight surgeons examined him. Carbon monoxide levels in his blood were still elevated 72 hours after the mission. They determined he had been flying with severe poisoning for the final 11 minutes of the flight. That level of impairment should have rendered him unconscious. He had somehow remained functional through will alone. On January 8, 1944, Lieutenant General Joseph Stilwell, commander of U.S. Forces China-Burma-India Theater, presented 2nd Lieutenant Philip Adair with the Silver Star. The citation read, "For gallantry in action against enemy forces, on December 13, 1943, when Lieutenant Adair, flying alone, engaged and disrupted a formation of 64 enemy aircraft, attacking Allied installations, continuing his attack despite severe aircraft damage and personal injury, thereby preventing destruction of critical supply facilities." Philip Adair flew 95 more combat missions with the 80th Fighter Group, bringing his total to 139. He achieved ace status with 5 confirmed kills. On his final mission in July 1944, he shot down 2 Ki-43 Oscars over northern Burma. He returned to the United States in September 1944, survived the war, and remained in the Air Force for 30 years. He retired as a full colonel in 1971. The 80th Fighter Group, the Burma Banshees, continued operations until August 1945. The unit destroyed 413 Japanese aircraft in aerial combat and 147 on the ground. They lost 63 pilots killed or missing. Their deaths' head-skull insignia became one of the most recognized markings in the China-Burma-India theater. The P-40 Warhawk never achieved the fame of the P-51 Mustang or P-47 Thunderbolt. It was slower than both. It couldn't fight effectively above 15,000 feet. By 1943, it was considered obsolete. Production ended in November 1944 after 13,736 aircraft were built. But in the hands of determined pilots like Philip Adair, the rugged Curtiss fighter proved what mattered most in combat wasn't the aircraft's specifications. It was the courage and skill of the pilot flying it. December 13, 1943 demonstrated this truth in terms no one could dispute. one pilot, one obsolete fighter, 64 enemy aircraft. The odds were impossible. The doctrine said, wait for reinforcements. Every tactical principle said, don't engage. But Philip Adair looked at those odds, thought about the men at Dinjan who couldn't defend themselves, and decided that impossible odds meant nothing when someone refuses to quit. His solution to damaged controls, flying alternately inverted and upright for 11 minutes, defied every standard flying procedure. His inverted landing approach with gear extended had never been attempted before and was never repeated. But it worked because Adair understood his aircraft intimately and was willing to try something that had never been done when conventional options had run out. The Burma Banshees fought a forgotten campaign in a forgotten theater. The China-Burma-India theater received a fraction of the resources and attention devoted to Europe and the Pacific Island campaigns. The Hump operation, despite being the first massive airlift in history and a proving ground for strategic airlift concepts that would later save Berlin, remains obscure outside specialized military history circles. But the men who flew and fought there displayed courage that deserves to be remembered. They battled not just Japanese forces, but weather, disease, hostile terrain, and supply shortages. They flew obsolescent aircraft against skilled enemies and prevailed through determination and tactical innovation. They kept China in the war, tied down 1 million Japanese troops who could have been deployed elsewhere, and proved that air power could sustain forces across impossible geography. Philip Adair's story stands as testament to what one determined individual can accomplish when the stakes are highest and failure isn't an option. He didn't wait for perfect conditions. He didn't wait for backup. He saw what needed to be done and did it, accepting risks that would make most people freeze. That kind of courage doesn't age. It doesn't become obsolete. It's as relevant today as it was on that December morning in 1943, when a 23-year-old pilot from Oklahoma looked at impossible odds and attacked anyway. If stories like this remind you why we preserve history and honor those who served, hit that like button, subscribe to our channel for more forgotten heroes of World War II, and turn on notifications so you never miss these stories. Drop a comment telling us where you're watching from and whether anyone in your family served in the China-Burma-India theater. Their stories matter. Their courage matters. And as long as we remember them, they'll never truly be forgotten. Thanks for watching. We'll see you in the next one.